Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Gebhardt. I'm a Cloud Solutions Engineer at Microsoft, and today I'm going to be giving you guys a quick tutorial on how to deploy an ARM template with PowerShell. So what is an ARM template? An ARM template is a Azure Resource Manager template which acts as a configuration file for your Azure infrastructure. It tells Azure what resources to deploy and how to configure them. This is extremely useful when you have a large and complex environment. Where going through manually in the portal and deploying each one of these would be a very long and quite painful task. So today we'll go over getting the development environment set up to deploy a template from PowerShell. We'll actually go through and create a template and then deploy it. So today we're going to be deploying a simple storage account to Microsoft Azure with an ARM template. If you're wanting to follow along at home, there's a couple things that you will need. One is an Azure subscription. Another is Windows PowerShell with the Azure RM module installed and loaded, and also a text editor. If you don't have any of these, you can look at the GitHub README, and I posted documentation in there on how to get everything set up. So the first thing we need to do is set our schema. The schema is what the template uses to validate against. So let's go to the internet and grab it. Azure ARM schema. Go to Azure's GitHub page. Lots of good content on here. I'll go through it later on in the video. But for now, we'll just grab the schema and get back to Visual Studio. So I'm using Visual Studio to write this template. You can use any old text editor you want, but I found that Visual Studio has a lot of great features for working with Microsoft products. Big surprise there. One of them is IntelliSense. So we start writing our template. We can see different options that we can put in. First thing we want to do is set the schema again. Paste it in. Next section is content version, which is basically just an internal system for you to keep track of your templates. If you want to update it, but you want to keep the old one, you can save it and save a new one with, 1.1. But we'll start with 1.0.0.0. Then after this, there's 4 sections that go into a template. First is parameters. Second being variables. Third being resources, where you describe your infrastructure, and lastly being outputs. So this is the basic structure of a template. You set the schema, the content version, and then the 4 sections are parameters, variables, resources, and output. First section we're going to start in is parameters. So we know we're going to be deploying a storage account, and we're going to want to set a couple user-defined parameters, such as account type and probably the name. So let's start with the storage account type. We'll just call it storage account type. And on these parameters, there's properties that you can set. One of them is type. And with IntelliSense, it shows you different values you can put in. And I know this is going to be a string. Oops, forgot a colon up here. We'll also set a default value in case the user forgets to set this. And we'll set the default to standard underscore LRS. This is just the type of storage account. So Microsoft defined variables. There's standard and premium. Set the default to standard. Another property we can set is allowed values. This prevents the user from putting in a value that Microsoft doesn't like, which is an array of strings. So standard LRS, hopefully that's allowed because that's the one we set as the default value. Standard GRS. Standard CRS. And finally, premium. So when a user is putting in this parameter when deploying the template, they'll only be allowed to use one of these, or else the script will throw them an error and not allow them to run it. Another property we can set is metadata. It's a good one, just basically a description of the parameter. So we'll throw a description and just call it storage account type. So another parameter that the user might want to set is name of their storage account. We'll just call this one storage account name prefix. We're calling it a prefix because I'm going to add a unique string onto it later, and I'll get into that when we get to it. Alright. And we'll set the type again. This will also be a string. Set a default value again, just in case they forget to set it themselves. We'll just call it storage. And some other properties we can set are max length and min length. This is an important one for name because Microsoft Azure has certain limits on the names of storage accounts. They can only be 24 characters long, and I believe they have to be at least 3 characters long. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be adding a unique string onto this, which is 13 characters long. So 24 minus 13 leaves us with only 11 characters left. So we'll set a max length here of 11. And since we'll be adding a unique string onto the variable name or storage account name later on, we won't need to set a min length to meet that requirement. But we will add the metadata tag again and add a description. Call it prefix for the storage account name. Alright, I think that's good for parameters. So next we're going to create a variable to be used in the template. It's going to be storage account name. The storage account name is going to be a combination of the prefix, storage account name prefix, which we set in the parameter section, and the unique string, which I mentioned earlier. So we'll start off with, we're going to use a function called concat, which is a ARM built-in string function to combine 2 strings together. So we will grab parameters And we will grab, what was it called? Storage account name prefix. So going into parameters, oops, spelled that wrong. And we're going to grab the value of storage account name prefix. And then we're going to want to concat that with a unique string. Unique string is also another built-in string function in ARM templates. And we're going to have to pass it a value to create that unique string with. And we will use the resource group ID. We'll have to pass in a resource group to the template when we're deploying it so it knows where to deploy it to. And we'll just use that resource group's ID to make it unique. So next we'll define what resource we want to deploy. But before we do that, let's do a quick recap of what we've done so far. So we set the schema, which the template uses to validate against. Set the content version, 1.0.0.0. And we set a couple of parameters, the first being storage account type. And it's a type string. We set a default value of standard underscore LRS in case the user forgets to set this parameter when deploying. And we've created an array of allowed values. So the user can't type in something that Microsoft does not allow. And we set a description for it, storage account type. We've also set a storage account name prefix parameter, also type string, set a default value of storage, and we set it a max length of 11. That's because earlier talked about how the max length for a storage account name is 24, and the unique string that we're concatenating it with down here is 13 characters long. So we don't want the prefix to be longer than 11. And then we set our variable name, which is storage account name, and we concat the parameter storage account name prefix, which the user passes in during deployment here, and then a unique string to give our storage account name. So now we're ready to describe our resource to deploy. The resources section is an array of objects, and each object is a resource. So we'll create an object for our storage account resource. And we'll give it a type. Type is storage accounts, Microsoft.storage. There we go, Microsoft.storage/storage accounts. We'll set its name, which we defined earlier in the variables section. So variables, then we'll grab the storage account name variable. Need to set what API version it's going to use. That's the Azure API version. And we'll say to 2016. We'll also need to set the location, so which Azure region our storage account is going to deploy to. And we'll grab this from our resource group. So when we're deploying this template, we'll define a resource group for it to live in, and we'll just tell it to live in that same resource group. So resource group, and we'll grab location from that. Need to set the SKU, which is the storage account type, whether what we said earlier, the premium or the standard. Their name is, we set this in parameters, I believe. Yes, parameters, storage account type. So we'll grab that from parameters. Parameters. Storage account Perfect. And then lastly, we need to set what kind it is, which indicates the type of storage account. And ours is just a regular old storage, not blob. And so that's all we need to define our resource. The type, the storage account, the name, which we set in the variables section, the API version, the Azure API version, location, where we're going to deploy it to. So we're going to take the resources group location and apply that to our resource, the SKU, what storage account, what its type is, premium or standard, which we set in the parameter section, and then the kind of storage account, blob storage or regular storage, and we set it to storage. So on to the last section of our template here, the output section. It's an extremely useful section. It can be used to display information at the completion of your template deployment. So what are some things that would be good to know about our storage account? Probably the name of the resource group it deployed to. So let's call that resource group name. And type of output is going to be a string. And the value, value is going to be resource group dot name. That's right. Resource group dot name. All right. What else would we want? Possibly the storage account name. So storage account name. Type, it's also going to be a string. Value, we'll just grab this from the variables section since we sent it there. So we set it there. Variables, and we called it storage account name. Yep. Storage account name, yep. Possibly the storage account location, so what region it deployed to, might be helpful to know. So storage account location. Oops, messed up my quotes there. Storage account location. And it's going to be another type string. Value. We're also going to grab this from the resource group. So resource group dot location. And that looks good. So at the end of our template deployment, it's going to display the resource group name, the storage account name, and the storage account location. So now that we have our template created, we need a way to deploy this thing. And to do that, we will use a PowerShell script. So for writing scripts, I like to use the PowerShell ISE. So we'll hop over into that, and I already have a file created, Azure deploy.ps1. So the first thing we're going to want to do is deploy a resource group. So we have a place for our storage account to live. So we'll set a variable here called resource group name, and we'll just call it jgebtest.rg. Set another variable for its location, resource group location, and we'll deploy it to East US. Now we have those two variables, we can use the Azure PowerShell command new Azure RM resource group to deploy one. And we'll also save this into a variable for later use in our script. So new Azure RM resource group. Have to pass it a couple parameters, name, which is resource group name, and location, which is resource group location. And that will deploy our resource group. All right, now we have our resource group created. So we need to actually deploy our template. First, we need to set a couple parameters that our template will use. We will use a hash table for that, and we'll just call it parameters. And if you remember, the parameters that we need to set for our template were storage account type, and if we flip back over to our template, we'll see storage account type right there. And so we didn't have to put anything in. It'll use standard LRS if we don't. But let's switch it up and make it a premium storage account. Copy that and drop that value in here. And the other one was storage account name prefix. And remember, this one had to be under 11 characters long. Or was it 13 characters? Let's see. Max length 11 characters. So we'll just call it Jeff storage. Under 11? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Nope, too many. We'll just call it Jeff. Sounds fun. Alright, now we have our parameters object. We're going to need to tell the script where our template is. So we'll create a variable for that, and we'll call it template path. And I'll show you where we are here. So let's do an ls on the folder here. I have my template.json, which we created earlier, and the Azure deploy is in the same directory. So we can just set that to /Azure, or to the template, not to Azure deploy, that's where we're in. So that's our path to our template. That's where the script's going to look. And then we can actually write our command to deploy the template. That command is new Azure rm resource group deployment. And a couple of parameters we need to set. One is the resource group name. We'll grab that from our resource group that we deployed earlier. So rg dot resource group name. And we need to point it to the actual template file. That was our template path that we set. So template file, it's our template.json, set to our template path variable. And lastly, we need to pass in that hash table of parameters. And that's called a template parameter object. Parameters. And we'll add verbose onto there so we get a little more output when we deploy the script. So now we need to connect to our Azure subscription. So I'll run the command connect Azure RM account. Throw my email in here. And sign in, and it should pull down my subscription. Yep, there it is. So let's just run through this real quick before hitting deploy, make sure everything looks good. Creating a new resource group, setting our parameters for the template, and then actually deploying the template. All right, cool. Let's hit deploy and see what happens. Oh, and we got some red. Template validation failed. Template function resource group. Ah, there we go. Typo, that should be resource group. So let's hop over to Visual Studio here. And there we go. Resource group .location. Hit save. Pop back over to PowerShell. and run the script again. It's just saying that the resource group already exists. You sure you want to update it? Yes, because we already ran the script and it made the resource group before it failed down here on the deployment. So we'll just use it and see if it works this time. Unable to parse language, resource group name, expect to let parentheses in an actual dot. Line 45. Forgot the parentheses there on the resource group method. All right, let's try this a third time. Yes, we want to update it. Another error, line 53. I had lots of typos. Resource group dot location. What's going on there? Resource. Oh, the parentheses on the actual method resource group, not on location. That's pulling the value. There we go. All right. Run this one last time. This should do it. Template is valid. And it's had verbose on, that's why you're seeing this extra output here. So there's the name of our resource, Jeff, that's the prefix, and the unique string is that latter part there. So since it's just a storage account we're creating, it shouldn't take too long, but you can imagine if you had a template that was creating, 1,000 VMs, and just a bunch of resources might take a while. So there we go. We have a success. So our resource was created, and you can see the output section here. It shows the resource group name, the account name, and location. So let's kind of just go through everything one last time before I sign off here. We have two files here. We have our Azure deploy.ps1, which is this script to actually deploy the template. And we have the template.json. So the script was just creating a resource group and then deploying the template. And our template has 4 main sections plus the schema and the content version. Sections being parameters, the user-defined variables, and then the variables section where we concatenated the account name prefix parameter with the unique string to make our storage name. Then the resource section where we actually define the resource. And lastly, the output section where we display information at the end of the template deployment. So that's that. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and learned a little bit about ARM templates and how to deploy them with PowerShell. If you would like the full and completed files, I added a link to the video description to the GitHub repo for these files. So feel free to clone them and mess around with them at your leisure. Thanks again.